record option now. Okay, so we are recording. Hello, welcome Badgers, and thank you for joining us today during homecoming and specifically the Researchers Corner session. My name is Jane Morrish. I received my master's degree in psychology at Brock University in 2012. I'm also a current Brock staff member working as the Knowledge Mobilization Officer at Brock's Office of Research Services, as well as our Lifespan Institute. And I also currently sit as the Vice President of Brock University's Alumni Association Board of Directors. For today, I am your co-host for this session, and I'm representing the Brock University Alumni Association. During this virtual homecoming, we have alumni joining us locally from across Canada, and as we just saw in the chat, internationally as well. Knowing this, we would like to begin today's event with a land acknowledgement, where we want to recognize the Indigenous communities that originally inhabited the land where Brock University sits today. So Brock University acknowledges the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Now, before we move into the presentations, there are a couple housekeeping items I just want to mention before we get started. This webinar, including all others throughout homecoming, will be available for viewing in the on-demand section of the Homecoming Hub, so you can actually come back and rewatch this Researchers Corner whenever you want. I encourage all of you to explore the Homecoming Hub following this session to add any events to your agenda that you may have missed, as well as to learn about the perks and benefits that come with being a Brock graduate. Finally, we encourage you to type any questions that come up in the chat box. Just simply click chat at the bottom of your screen to access the chat box, and we'll address your questions at the end of the presentation. We also have Christine here monitoring if you have any kind of tech issues going on, but feel free to use that chat box throughout. With those housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest speakers who will be leading us through today's session. Our first speaker will be Dr. Miriam Richards, who is a professor of several courses that specialize in animal behavior, ecology, and evolution at Brock University. When she isn't studying the social behaviors of carpenter and sweat bees or conducting research on the restoration of local bee communities, she can be found gardening or riding her mules. Dr. Richard treasures her first science experience at Brock University when she attended the Brock Science Camp during the summer of 1973. Next, we'll have Dr. Karen Patte, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Health Sciences at Brock University. There she teaches the Child Health undergraduate program and supervises graduate students in the Faculty of Applied Health Science. She has completed several degrees in health science, kinesiology, and health psychology, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship in population health research. Dr. Patte's current research examines how different contexts and exposures shape mental health trajectories over adolescence to inform more effective preventative practice, policy, and programs. And our last speaker will be Dr. Mariek Schmidt, who's an associate professor of earth sciences at Brock University and a geologist who studies volcanic rocks on both Earth and Mars. Along with her many accomplishments, including working as a postdoctoral fellow at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and participating in the Mars Science Laboratory mission with NASA, Dr. Schmidt actively investigates the history of volcanic fields and other terrestrial research. Thank you all for being here today. And as a reminder to everyone, just keep typing those questions in throughout. I will keep track for the Q&A session at the end. And right now, I'll just let our speakers take it away, starting with Dr. Richards. So I turn the virtual floor over to you, Dr. Richards.
Good afternoon. Just make sure that my microphone is working. Everybody can hear. You don't actually have to answer, but you let me know in the chat if it's not working. So I'm going to talk about one aspect of our work today. We do a lot of different things in our research with bees. And what I'm going to talk about today is on the conservation side, but also the side that is a bigger and bigger part of our work, which is more community engagement and helping people to understand why bees are important and what they can do to help bees. So my talk is called Promoting Pollinators, Niagara's Bees and How to Help Them. And I do want to say that although I'm talking specifically about Niagara bees, because those are the ones that we do most of our research on now, the principles that I'm going to talk about apply certainly across Southern Ontario to most of the world, wherever human populations are growing, especially in cities, urban landscapes, and suburban landscapes. So some of the things I'm going to talk about, even if you're as far away as Oxford, these principles apply. I haven't been an extremely good alumna, but I am actually an alumna because I am not, my first science experience at Brock was indeed science camp, which doesn't actually operate anymore, but way back in 1973. But I was a faculty kid because my mother was a professor in the Faculty of Ed and an undergraduate here. So I am an alumna. I don't do alumni activities too often because I work here instead. And I've been at Brock since about 1996, so September of 1996, so quite a long time. And all that time we've been studying bees in various aspects. And here's a little tiny sweat bee, a couple millimeters long on a spring flower.
Dr. Richards, I don't think you've shared your screen yet.
Oh,
for us
you're
to
right.
see the
Sorry.
slides. Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I get for switching to.
Maybe the bee flew away.
Yeah, okay, there, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So here's the little bee. Thank you for the reminder. Here's a little tiny sweat bee sitting on a spring flower in my garden. So the Brock Bee Lab, as we call ourselves, is myself and various grad students, often 4 or 5 grad students, a variety of undergrads, sometimes some technical help. And we mainly study bee behavior, ecology, and evolution. But conservation has become a bigger and bigger part of what we do. Here is another little sweat bee. This one was actually sitting on my knee sometime in July. So these little hairs that you can see right here, those are actually giving you a good idea of the scale that we're looking at. So those are little hair on my knee. So a little tiny bee, and you may have encountered some of these pesky little things. They're called sweat bees because they land on you and start licking up sweat in the summer, especially in July. And these little tiny green ones are especially prone to doing this. And this is a member of a genus called Lasioglossum. Most of these don't yet have common names. But this little female is one of 160 plus species that we have documented as living in Niagara. Why do bees actually matter to anybody besides, say, bee biologists? Well, myself, I think that biodiversity and the natural world matters and is important in and of itself. I think it has intrinsic value, but we often end up having to justify why we want to keep things in terms of the value to humans. And one of the most important reasons that pollinators matter is that about 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food that humans consume is provided by the activities of insects, including, for the most part, pollinators, the majority of which are, and the most effective of which are bees. So food is obviously important. So here I have here in my garden with some giant sunflower heads a couple years ago, and each of the sunflower seeds in those heads was produced as the result of pollinating activity. Tomatoes, this is a great season for tomatoes in Niagara. Tomatoes don't flower unless they are what we call buzz pollinated by bees. Only a very few bees, and they have very, very sticky pollen, and a bee has to land on them, vibrate her wings and her whole body, and therefore the flower at a specific frequency that causes the pollen to fly off, and she gathers it. Aside from the food, of course, many of us love flowers, and flowers have other kinds of ecological values, and many, many of these are reliant on bees and other pollinators for plant sex, which is what creates seeds, which is what allows plants to move, to grow. The reason that bees are very good pollinators and are specialized as pollinators is because they have a need to collect nectar and pollen. Pollen is the primary food source for bee babies. And so females have to collect pollen in order to reproduce. The adult bees also need nectar because that is the fuel that they, for the most part, use themselves for powering their flight muscles and their activities. And many kinds of insects actually live on flower nectar. So basically, flowers have co-opted this need of bees, and as a way of getting their pollen away from where it was created on their home flower and onto other flowers. That plants have a problem with mating, basically, because they are stuck where they are in position, and they somehow have to get their gametes to another plant. They can't do that because they can't move. So what they do is they get other animals to move things around for them. And so over time, there's this co-evolved mutualism between plants and bees especially, but also other kinds of pollinators. Here's a little bee here on this milkweed, and a bee on a chicory. These are all local plants. Here's a fuzzy bee here. And you notice this crab spider, which is just hoping that this bee will get close enough that it will pounce on it and eat it. This particular bee got away just after I took the photograph. But you can see this is complicated. Here's a beetle that is also a pollinator. So these bees need pollen, and therefore, and so they are attracted to flowers. Flowers attract bees by offering more pollen than the flowers need to have spread around. Some of it sticks to bees. Bees move it around, and flowers get their pollen moved to fertilize other individuals. So these pollination reactions are a fundamental part of terrestrial ecosystems. So many kinds of plants are completely dependent on animal pollinators to move pollen around. So the mother bees collect the pollen, and then what do they do with it? They bring it back to their nests. Bees have homes, and we call them sometimes technically central place foragers, but really they just have homes. They have nests, and often in many ways behave exactly like tiny little birds. Their nests can come in a variety of forms, and in Niagara, there are many kinds of what we call nesting habitats for bees. Most commonly, the vast majority of bees in Niagara, but also across the whole planet, live in the ground. They dig burrows, and here's a kind of a schematic of a burrow. Up here is the top, the nest entrance, with some soil that's being pushed out and made a little bit of a tumulus around. And there's a burrow that extends downward. Throughout the season, burrows get deeper and deeper, especially in hot climates as the nest grows, and the mothers put their baby bees deeper and deeper in the nest. Each of these little spaces is what we call a brood cell. And here's an illustration of a nest that has 5 little brood cells in it. The mother has been out working extremely hard, gathering more than her body weight usually of pollen and nectar that she then forms into a ball, and then she puts a tiny little egg on it. Usually she just leaves the baby alone. The egg hatches in a few days. The larva consumes its pollen, and here you can see some hatched larvae that are consuming their pollen. They eat the whole thing. When they run out of food, they know it's time to enter the next stage of development, and they pupate, and they continue as juveniles, but as pupae, and eventually they emerge as adults. Most of the bees, and this might be surprising to some people, most bees around here are actually solitary. So each mother raises her own eggs all by herself, her own offspring. But some of the bees, and we focus our research on these, are social. Here's a tiny little sweat bee queen who's guarding her nest entrance. Here is another female, probably one of her workers, who wants to be able to come back in, and they're having a little bit of a discussion about whether or not. And in fact, in this case, This discussion went on for several minutes before the queen backed down and allowed the other female in. Also very common in Niagara and beyond are carpenter bees. The small carpenter bees, like this one called Seratina, nest in twigs. So this is a raspberry cane, and you'll often see them in your garden if you see pruned roses or raspberry canes, or sometimes other kinds of woody stems with a perfectly round hole in the center. Almost certainly a carpenter bee has created a burrow and put her nest inside. The big carpenter bees nest in human structures. They're much the biggest bee in the area, the biggest bees in Canada. And if you live in Niagara, you may have seen them. And we do a lot of research on the behavior of these bees that I don't have time to talk about today, but they are really fun. And if you've got some, I'm sure they're pests, but they're very entertaining to watch. You've probably seen leafcutter bees. If you have certain kinds of plants in your garden, you may notice that there are perfectly circular holes forming in the leaves. As leafcutter mamas come along, cut little discs of leaf, as this one is doing, they take them home to their the holes where they are nesting, and they line the holes with these leaves and put their eggs and pollen in there. So these bee hotels that you can buy are for leaf cutter bees. Finally, there are cuckoo bees. These are bees that don't build their own nests. They're just like cuckoo birds. They actually hijack the efforts of ground nesting bees. They sneak into nests and replace the eggs of the host with their own. So all different kinds of bees. And then one thing we have here that is quite special in Niagara, this is not the right species because we haven't managed to get a photo, but there are also snail shell nesters. And we actually found the first example of that in Canada at the Glen Quarry, where they are, and at Brock, where they are very common because we have so many land snails. So the mothers gather all this pollen and nectar to make larval provisions. Can take between up to a day usually of work for a female to gather enough pollen to make one kid. They lay an egg on it, and then, as I said, the egg hatches and starts eating. So here's a baby bee, a larva here, and I hope you can see it. Here's its mouth at this end. It has consumed maybe half of its pollen. You can see it's sitting around, curled around its pollen. So they basically just stay attached to their food for about a week, eating steadily. And when they run out of food, I'll just play that one more time in case you couldn't see it. When they run out of food, then they metamorphose into the more recognizable bee form and continue growing or developing. So the good news for bees is that in Niagara and other places, despite the fact that Niagara is actually a highly developed and highly altered landscape, bees can thrive in many environments, and that includes urban environments. So here we have a Google Maps version of Niagara, the Niagara Peninsula. You can see there are a lot of big cities. There is some dark green, and that's a few remaining patches of more or less intact forest, although there's basically no, except for some tiny fragments, basically no original forest left. But Niagara only has about 17% forest cover now, compared to what may have been close to 80 or 90% under 300 or 400 years ago. So we have very little, we have very strongly altered habitats. We also have a lot of roads and a lot of agriculture. So it's a challenge for bees and other wildlife. The bad news is that the little bit of forest that we have left and the little bits of natural heritage site that we have left in Southern Ontario, especially in Niagara, are disappearing very, very quickly. And if the habitat of of wildlife disappears, the wildlife disappears as well. So bees will disappear if we don't save their habitat. And so one of the things we want to know is, what can we do to stop this? Given the realities of continued population growth, how can we fix this? What we need to know is, where can we find bees? I pulled this image of the perfect lawn and garden in suburbia from a lawn care company advertisement. This is not a place that bees can live in. There's no food in the form of flowers. There are basically no nest sites because there's no open soil, there's no sticks, there's no shrubs. The ground soil is completely covered with tidy mulch, and no lawn gets to be this beautiful without poisons being added. The solution then has to be that we need to preserve remaining habitat. So what natural habitat we have, even though it's not very much, needs to be preserved. And more, possibly even more importantly, we need to create new habitats. And this can be done both by government and by private citizens. I'm going to just show you a little bit about what Niagara Regional Government has done, and then we'll talk about what we can do. So we do a lot of our work, the university is here. We do a lot of our work at the Glen Quarry, and depending, I am old enough to remember when the Glen Quarry was one of the most obnoxious landfills in North America. It was actually on a list when I was a child of North America's 10 worst landfills. It was leaking toxic leachate, was horrible. Bees and everything else basically had been, wildlife had been eradicated. There were also two fairly big landfills, one of them in Wainfleet called Station Road, and one in Port Colborne, Elm Street. Niagara Region decided to rehabilitate these landfills when they were closed as parks because the landfills filled up. So Glen Ridge was rehabilitated in 2003 and the other two in 2011. And by that, I mean, it was covered up, etc., and planted, became available for pollinators in, once again. This is what the quarry looked like in 2003, so the park near the university. And you can see it was basically hydro-seeded with a, and so it was just short grass, not too interesting, but a lot nicer than a huge garbage dump that it had been. And there were some peripheral plantings of some wildflowers around the edges. Now, this is a picture from last year, and you can see, it looks quite different now. It's starting to look like a wild space. Time has made a huge difference. Did it work from the point of view of bees? Well, it certainly did. We now know that there is at least 158 bee species living in this park. So it's not a huge park, but there's a lot of bee species. So that, to give some perspective for bird watchers, for instance, that's far more than the number of birds that you would find in here. Elm Street was restored in after 10 years. Has now at least, which is much smaller, has at least 80 different bee species in it. And Station Road, which is the tiniest of these sites, has at least 86 different bee species now, remembering that these are places from which bees were eradicated. And so what is clear is that habitat restoration works. If you build bee habitat, bees will come. As long as there's a place for them nearby where they've been surviving, they will move into the new habitat. And it's a science talk, so I have to show one graph. And the blue is fields at Brock. The orange is representing the Quarry Park. And the height of the bars represents our measure of how many bees on average there are each year. And you can see that way back at the beginning of the restoration, bees arrived very quickly, but there were a lot more bees in the fields at Brock, which hadn't been sprayed and weren't mowed very much for a long time. Within a couple of years, however, the park ended up with far more bees, and now consistently the park has far more bees than the university fields. So restoration and continued care really work. So what can you do, even whether in Niagara or Hamilton or England or wherever you might be? It's pretty easy, actually. Restoring bee habitat is about attitudinal change. You need to learn to see your property as a wildlife habitat. And that means not wanting it to be too tidy, like that picture that I showed you. Freeing up your time and mowing your lawn less, not tidying up too much. The part I like best is planting more flowers. Always avoid pesticides and herbicides because bees are wild bees especially are extraordinarily sensitive to them. And if you have the energy, push local decision makers to do the same, because creating bee habitat is something that happens at a local level. And you can add, the simplest thing you can do is just add flowers. Bees love flowers. As this carpenter bee shows you, look at the way she's going nuts on this poppy. They don't even have to be native flowers. They need to be flowers that offer pollen rewards to bees, because that's what they need to eat. So when we learn to see landscapes from a bee's point of view, they start to look different. Some people will say that this is untidy and unkempt. I think it's a beautiful example of biodiversity. And from the point of view of a bee flying through it, it's basically a buffet. Here up close is a flower that many of us would call a weed. It's a native plant, and you can see that a bee landed on it looking for nectar. So the key to creating bee habitat is providing food, lots of flowers, blooming from spring until fall, different kinds of flowers, native and non-native, and also providing living spaces. So for accessible soil surface, no mulch, stems and twigs, holes and crevices, and you will have a bee paradise. So there are so many bees and always so little time, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richards. Up next, we have Dr. Patte.
Okay, thank you. Tough act to follow, very interesting. I had no idea there were so many bees. But I feel better about my lack of garden upkeep. So I'm going to share my screen here. Way it works. All right, so I will be talking about the impact of the COVID pandemic. I'm sure you've heard of it. You're probably sick of thinking about it, but specifically related to school closures and reopenings and the impact on youth mental health. So one of the primary concerns about the COVID pandemic measures has been that we'll experience a shadow pandemic of poor mental health and mental illness. And adolescents are believed to be at particularly high risk of experiencing these adverse impacts. It's a time when a lot of our mental illnesses arise, and it's also these lockdown measures such as stay-at-home orders, limits on social gatherings, they're at odds with adolescent development. It's a time when peer relationships are a priority and they're seeking autonomy from their parents. So they've undergone unprecedented changes, as we all have, with the longest and widest reaching school closures. And schools are an important context for mental health. It's where many of our programs are delivered. It's where a lot of concerns are first recognized for early intervention. It gives them structure and routine in their day. There is a lot of recreational and extracurricular activities that help them regulate emotions, that promote their healthy development, identity development, and build their self-confidence. It's also a time that or contexts where they have access to hopefully other trusted adults, which can be particularly important for youth who don't have as healthy or supportive home lives. So we see that there could be many different detrimental exposures, particularly if their school closures resulted from them being at home with a very stressful home environment. There's been a lot of economic impacts and so on. But we can't kind of think of a broad reaching because there might also be some subsets of our population or some positives that result as well. If you think of a youth who had a very negative school environment, for example, who was bullied in school, those school closures could have actually provided some kind of relief from that. But then we think about what happens when they have to go back into that environment. So there's many different factors at play. And in response, there's been a lot of research that has been rapidly developed to answer some of these questions. And we are seeing elevated psychological distress in youth since the onset of the pandemic. However, a lot of these studies, and they have each has their own value and purpose, but they look at youth cross-sectionally. So in order to see if their anxiety or distress has increased, they look at population averages and then compare it to previous averages, which will really robustly evaluate if the COVID pandemic has had a negative impact on mental health. We need what's called prospective data. We need to follow youth over time, and starting from before the pandemic, ideally, so that we can see how does mental health change over time, and is there sustained impact? Does it return to those pre-pandemic levels over time as we move towards recovery? And also thinking, given these many changes, some kind of distress or emotional response could be considered really normal and a healthy emotional response. So it's also important to look at what is the magnitude of change. Are they in a very high risk level that we need to intervene? And as I said, do they return? Is the change sustained, or do they return to those pre-pandemic levels? So to answer some of these many questions, my team and I received a grant from Sick Kids Foundation and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to do what's called a mixed method study. So that just means that we have both the qualitative strand. In our case, we're doing interviews with youth to get more in-depth explanations of some of what we see in our quantitative survey strand. I'll be talking today focusing on this quantitative survey strand. In this strand, we're leveraging data from a large national prospective study, and it's called the COMPASS study. And we're looking at this pre-pandemic data, the during pandemic data, and post-pandemic. Hopefully that will happen sometime soon, and looking at those changes over time. Who's at greater risk of adverse changes? And what are some of those risk and protective factors at the student, school, and surrounding area level? We're engaging youth throughout. We have youth across Canada as partners of this research to inform it. We know that it's a recognized right of youth to be involved in decisions that impact them. And we also know that when youth are engaged, the research better reflects their experience and needs, and results in recommendations for policy or programs that are more effective in meeting those needs. So briefly, what is the COMPASS study? Well, it's a large prospective cohort study. It started in 2012, and we collect data once annually. We are now moving into our 10th year of data collection over the current school year. We collect data in 4 Canadian provinces: Ontario, Quebec, BC, and Alberta. Each year, about 65,000 adolescents participate from over 130 secondary schools. So it's prospective in that we follow, we can link individual data. So we can look at student survey results as they go from grade 9 to grade 12 across secondary school. So looking at those mental health trajectories over secondary school and how those trajectories vary based on different factors. It's designed primarily to evaluate programs, policies, and what we call natural experiments. Natural experiments are when a change happens that's not investigator controlled. So we can't randomize who's impacted by that change and have a control group. So COVID is certainly the ultimate natural experiment, and we'll be using this COMPASS data to evaluate it. So looking within COMPASS, I'll be focusing on the student level data primarily, but we also do look at the environment as well. So we were collecting data, and then within the 2019-2020 school year, of course, schools closed. So we shifted online during that phase, and we collected data from over 9,600 students in that initial lockdown period, so the spring 2020, the first wave of COVID. And I'll be sharing results from that phase, as well as some preliminary results from the last school year as well, where we had over 53,000 students participate. And then this school year, we'll be collecting data again. So the first part of the results that I want to present are over 3 ways. So students completed questionnaires on their mental health and many different areas of what COMPASS actually looks at on 3 different time periods, each separated by a year. The importance of, we looked at 2 pre-COVID waves and that difference. The importance of this is that we know there are many changes over adolescence as a period of development. So we need to know, what are we expected to see in mental health changes over that time, so that we can make conclusions about did the change related to COVID differ in relation to what change we're expected to see. So first, looking at depression symptoms, and higher scores here indicate higher depression symptoms. We looked at, again, across those 3 waves. So 2018 was pre-COVID, 2019 pre-COVID, and then 2020 was that initial first lockdown. You can, and it's by age here. So in case the rate of change differs depending on what age they are when that they're answering. And then we also have it by gender. So what we're seeing here, as you can see, there's a consistent increase in depression symptoms across all of these lines. So all these youth, there was an increase in depression symptoms, both in the pre-COVID wave and the wave of the initial lockdown. We also see, in terms of gender, that girls are consistently higher than boys across the board, and that's as expected and fits with the literature that girls do report greater depression and anxiety symptoms. But well, it's very concerning that we're seeing a consistent increase in depression and anxiety symptoms over adolescents, and that fits with the literature. So that alone, apart from COVID, is concerning. But what's interesting here is you'll see that that increase in symptoms in that COVID-related wave is not greater than that increase we see in the pre-COVID wave. So based on this, and it's really the most kind of robust impact analysis we can do, we did not see an increase in depression in that early lockdown, that first spring 2020 lockdown. Very similar story when we look at anxiety symptoms. Again, girls consistently higher across the board than boys, but largely parallel. So girls aren't being more impacted than COVID than boys, or vice versa. Again, we see that anxiety symptoms increase with each year. So with age, including pre-COVID. And again, we see that that increase in symptoms in this COVID wave was not greater than expected based on what we typically see with age outside of COVID. In some cases, it even looks like there was a less of an increase in anxiety symptoms. Moving on to flourishing, or what's called psychosocial well-being. So this is life purpose and meaning, rewarding relationships, optimism, self-confidence. So general mental well-being as opposed to mental illness symptoms. And a similar story in that in some cases, and in this case, this again, higher scores are poorer well-being in this as well. So again, we see that girls often, and it differs by age, but girls often had poorer mental well-being than boys. And we see that mental well-being did show a slight decline with age over adolescence as well. But generally, we don't see that there was a greater decline in well-being over that COVID phase than there was pre-COVID. It actually looks like it's pretty much flat as opposed to the decline in well-being we saw in pre-COVID waves over adolescence. So what do we make about this? This first initial lockdown really kind of put a pause on everything in adolescents' lives, that everything kind of stopped. And for whatever reason, that stop seemed to put a pause on what is, or didn't interfere with that decline in mental health that we're seeing over adolescence. So I think we need to really pay more attention to why does mental health decline over adolescence in the first place. But we can't conclude that that initial lockdown was negative. And it fits with what we're hearing in our interviews too from youth, that they say that initial school closure was it was a nice break. It was an early summer. It was a relief from the pressures of school. So it was experience very different than the story we're hearing now, though. So while that initial lockdown was a nice break, across the current school year or this past school year that we're looking at now, it seems to be a different story. That it got tiresome, and certainly seeing more mental health related distress. So I'm going to show just preliminary data past on this previous school year. And this data is just from Ontario only. And again, it has those pre-COVID waves, that initial lockdown wave, and then it has this last school year divided between the fall and the spring terms. It's divided based on those students who were learning in person. So for, of course, first pre-COVID, everyone in person, that initial lockdown, everyone online, but then more split across this past school year. So looking at anxiety symptoms, and this differs from what I just showed you. This is not that prospective data. This isn't following individual students. This is our sample averages. So the sample averages for anxiety symptoms are pretty steady, those pre-COVID waves. And then when everyone was online, but you see quite a split once this past school year. So those who were learning online had quite clearly some higher average anxiety symptoms compared to those who were learning in person at that time. But it's important to keep in mind, as I said, this is the repeat cross-sectional, not individual change, that some students in Ontario had an option to learn online. So did those with higher anxiety symptoms initially choose to learn online, or did online learning contribute to anxiety symptoms? Is it both? So that's what we'll be able to sort out with our data now. Similar story with depression symptoms, those learning online, clearly higher depression symptoms than those who are learning in person, which seems like it potentially might be kind of returning to those pre-pandemic levels. So we'll follow them in the future to see what happens. But overall, I will alert you that this is depression symptoms. Scores above 10 are considered clinically relevant at high risk of clinical depression. And overall, even pre-pandemic, that it's pretty concerning levels of depression in youth. So if you're interested in more, that was a quick snapshot. We share results in many different ways. You can follow along on social media. We have a group of great youth who develop all of the Instagram results to share other results with youth. And then we also have some Twitter result accounts as well. And acknowledge it's a very large team, and we're lucky to have our funders of Canadian Institute of Health Research, Sick Kids, and Health Canada. And that is it for me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patte. I follow Compass on Instagram, so I will also do a second shout out for that. There's some really great posts that come out that, again, are all youth made. We are on to our final presentation now, and I welcome Dr. Schmidt to the virtual floor.
Hello, let me just get my my screen going. Can you see that?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you very much. So I am a geologist. I'm in the Earth Sciences department, and I am fortunate enough to have two planets that I study. I study both Earth and Mars, and here's a couple field sites, one on Earth. The one on the left is the Fort Rock Tuff Ring in Oregon, and you can see some layered volcanic rock there. And then on the right, there's a landscape that actually looks very reminiscent of Earth, but that's actually a scene that was captured by the Curiosity rover in Yellowknife Bay and Gale Crater, Mars. So this is a picture that a lot of you guys received as alumni in your mailboxes. I was featured in Surgite over the summer. And so that was just sort of a first teaser. And then today I'm going to dig a little bit deeper about what my research entails. And what I get interested in Mars for is that, and what a lot of people are interested in Mars for, is to understand whether or not we are alone. And is Mars another potentially habitable environment or habitable planet? So what I'm showing here is a plot of stars on the left-hand side, and our sun is a very average yellow star, and our solar system, the planets are trending outward away from it. And what we think is a reasonable place where life could thrive is shown here in blue as this habitable zone. And you can see that Venus is much too hot, Mercury is way too hot, but Mars just sits right outside of this habitable zone. And we wonder whether or not Mars could have hosted life in the past. We have indication that Mars was once warmer and wetter in the past. And so now we are really looking to see if we can identify habitable environments and find evidence of past life. So if we compare the two planets, Earth and Mars, there's a couple of really big differences that jump out at you. One being the presence of all the blue stuff on Earth, and that is that Earth has abundant liquid water. On Mars, Mars does not have abundant liquid water. There is water present as ice caps, as well as in the subsurface, entrained in minerals, as well as there's water vapor, which is found as clouds in Mars. But the reason why liquid water is not stable on the surface of Mars is that the atmospheric pressure is so low that that liquid water is no longer stable. But there is lots of evidence of past water on Mars. There are giant canyon systems, there's stream channels. We have abundant evidence of in minerals that contain a lot of water within their chemical formulas, and things like that. Okay, so water is one reason why there's a lot of life on Earth. But there's another thing that's going on here as well, and that is that Mars is much smaller than the Earth. And so Mars, because it's smaller, it's about the same age as the Earth. It's the same age as the Earth, I should say, but it's been able to cool to a greater degree than the Earth. So the Earth is still very hot in the interior. It has a liquid outer core that generates our magnetic field. And that magnetic field protects us from solar radiation. For Mars, there's no longer a liquid outer core, but there's good evidence that there was once a liquid outer core on Mars. And so we're looking to find evidence of a past magnetic field in the rocks of Mars. So what do? I look at both Earth and Mars. I participate in planetary rover missions, as well as conduct terrestrial geological studies. And so I work on both planets. And the reason is that first, discoveries made by landed rover missions directly inform the direction of terrestrial or Earth-based research. So we find something on Mars that we can't understand. What I do is I go and I identify an environment on Earth that looks like it's analogous, and I can ask those kinds of questions there. The other thing is that scientific results and experience gained by terrestrial studies are really fundamental to interpreting the geology of other planets. So by having experience working in the fields on Earth, I can look at rocks on Mars, and I know how to interpret those rocks based on that past experience. And so I have a bunch of field sites that I work on. So on Earth, I focus on long-lived volcanic fields, including the Oregon Cascade Range. There's a Fort Rock volcanic field in Central Oregon. I've worked in New Mexico, Hawaii, Iceland, and Nevada. And here's just a couple of pictures of me, one being Askja in Iceland. This is probably the most Martian landscape I've ever visited, and I can't wait to go back. But also here's the Mount Taylor volcanic field in New Mexico. For Mars, I work on landed missions, particularly focused on places where where rovers have been active. And I've been fortunate to be able to participate in 3 different rover missions. As a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institute, I started to work on Mars missions. And so the Spirit rover explored this site known as Home Plate, which is a pyroclastic or a volcanic deposit. Since 2012, I've been a participating scientist in the Mars Science Laboratory mission, which has been exploring Gale Crater for that whole time. And then the one that people are most excited about right now is the Mars 2020 rover mission, which landed just earlier this year in February. And that's been exploring Jezero Crater. And here's just a picture of me when I was first getting started working on rover missions. This is, here I am at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. And this rover is about the size of a small golf cart. The rovers now that are exploring Mars are like the size of an SUV. So they've really changed over time. For my fieldwork, I bring students along with me, and here's a number of students that have visited different places with me all over the American West. So this is in Oregon, Hawaii, Nevada, again in Oregon, and then here is Death Valley in California. Okay, so what am I looking at? Well, what am I interested in? I'm interested in basically understanding what the relative contributions of different geological processes are and how they affect volcanic rocks on Earth and Mars. And so basically, when you look at a rock, there is a lot of history that goes into making that rock, okay, as you see it today on the surface of the Earth or on the surface of Mars. So when we look at a volcanic rock, there are igneous processes. Those are magmatic processes that occur underground. And those include things like crystallization and melting. Once a volcano actually erupts, you can have lava flows, or you can have explosive eruptions that fragment, it breaks apart the magma, and that creates a lot of little bits. And those little bits are sediments that can then be transported and be carried, either during the eruptive processes of when the volcano is actually erupting, or by later stream flow, okay, and deposition that way. And then another thing that I look at is aqueous alteration, and that being alteration of rock caused by water. And so this rock that we're looking at here, this is a layered pyroclastic rock. So it's a rock that formed during an explosive eruption that tore the magma up to little bits, like I described. But this particular deposit, it's a basaltic composition, okay? So it's rich in magnesium and in iron, very much like rocks that you see in a place like Hawaii, for example. And the rocks that you've seen in pictures of Hawaii, or maybe you've been fortunate to go to a place like that, where the rocks are very dark and black, and that's the basaltic composition. Here you can see that this rock has been changed to more orangey, yellow, brown colors, and that is caused by a reaction with water at relatively warm temperatures. And so that causes alteration to occur. The other sort of alteration I'm looking for is what's called biotic alteration, and that is when you have actual microorganisms interacting with the rock itself. So here we have a rock a little bit more close up. You can see there's some rocks that have been altered to orange and red, and then the spaces between those grains, there are different minerals that are precipitated there, and those form in the presence of water. So I was looking for habitable environments in Fort Rock volcanic fields, and then what I was lucky to do was actually slice some of those rocks up and looked at them in the microscope, and I actually found evidence of life living off of those rocks itself. And what I'm showing here are some microscopic images of thin sections of rock where we see evidence that microorganisms, microbes most likely, have actually dissolved volcanic glass, and they're most likely eating it. They're using it to actually get nutrients to be able to thrive, and those nutrients are probably things like transition metals like iron. And so what I'm showing here are a bunch of different morphologies that we've seen. These are considered candidate trace fossils, also called ichnofossils. So those would be like tracks and other kinds of or burrows that we see in the fossil record. And they're actually in basaltic glass. The features themselves are texturally diverse. They have, in this case, they have these sort of palmate terminations to these tubules. We see here there's sort of these mushroom-like terminal enlargements. Some of them are actually relatively smooth, and others are annulated and are annulated with these little enlargements along their length. And so we see a lot of really interesting morphologies, and these are all consistent with having been formed by microbes. We've done other sorts of statistical analysis that demonstrates that that's a likely formation mechanism for these things to occur. The temperatures of formation are warm, so 25 to 85 degrees Celsius, and we know that by looking at the mineralogy, at the minerals that form in these rocks. We can constrain their the chemistry of the fluids as well. So neutral to alkaline conditions. This occurred at a near surface environment and in a lacustrine or lake setting. So basically these are basaltic fragmental rocks that erupted in a lake. So if we are going to look for life on Mars, this is a really good kind of rock that we want to, or really good type of life that we think could possibly live or thrive on Mars, because it's basaltic rocks on Mars. There's probably a lot of volcanic glass. We also see evidence of these basalts interacting with aqueous fluids. So we want to find this on Mars, but here's the tricky thing, is that these things are super, super tiny. These scale bars are 20 microns. Okay, they're so small, you can't see them I can't see them with a hand lens. I have to take these rocks home and look at them with a microscope. They're also located inside the rock itself. So you have to slice the rock open in order to actually view it. You can't see these just by looking at a rock at the surface. So in order to be able to find these kinds of features, we have to, on Mars, we have to actually go to Mars, find rocks that are likely to contain these features, and then eventually return them back to Earth. And so that's sort of the goal of the Perseverance rover. Perseverance was sent to actually find evidence of past life. And so here's a picture of myself with the Curiosity rover at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California. Again, this rover is about the size of a SUV. So really big, and on its arm, it has a suite of instruments on it, and it has the ability to collect rock cores that we will tell it to collect. It'll cache them and return them to Earth. What are these cores going to look like? Here's just a little sampling tube. And these tubes are collecting cores of rock. We're drilling into the rock itself. They're about 6 centimeters long and about the width of a pencil. So they're relatively small. Our goal is to collect at least 20 to return to Earth. And they're being collected and stored upon the rover right now. Eventually, the rover is going to drop off those samples and we're going to bring them back to Earth. So how is that going to happen? Here we have some schematic artist conceptions for how this might occur. The idea is that there's going to be another mission that is going to send a fetch rover. So a rover that's actually going to drive over to Perseverance and pick up the sample cache. Okay. And then that fetch rover is going to deliver that sample cache to a lander. And that lander is going to contain an ascent vehicle that it will then shoot those samples into orbit. There's going to have to be a third mission that is going to actually retrieve those samples from orbit. And those samples from orbit, there could be an orbiter that will do that. Another potential mechanism for retrieving those from orbit would be to actually send astronauts to pick those up. But keep in mind that this is long way off, but it's all going to probably happen within many of our lifetime. NASA is actually aiming to return samples to Earth by about 2034. So stay tuned for those. So where was Perseverance sent? Perseverance was sent to this location on Mars. And so what you're looking at here is a digital elevation map of the surface of Mars. And there's these features on Mars that are pretty big. The biggest one I want to draw your attention to is that the higher elevation regions are shown in reds and yellows. And then the deeper regions are shown in blues. Okay, and so there's this dichotomy here where the southern highlands and the northern lowlands sit. Okay, so there's this boundary that separates those two regions of Mars. And the Perseverance rover was sent just at the edge of that boundary between the southern highlands, which are much older, they're more cratered, and the northern lowlands, which have fewer craters, it's smoother, and it's a younger surface. If there was ever an ocean on Mars, that's still an open source of debate. If there was ever an ocean on Mars, it would have existed in these northern lowlands. But along this boundary, there's a lot of evidence for fluvial activities. So by that I mean evidence from looking at the surface of Mars. We see evidence of streams and rivers and canyons, etc., lakes, things like that. And so Perseverance was sent to one such place. This is a picture of Jezero crater. So this is Jezero crater. This is a site where we think there was once a lake bed. And why do we think that? Well, there's this stream channel that opens into this crater. And there's also an outflow channel. Okay, so this suggests that water collected here and then it flowed outward. Another feature that is really interesting is that at the mouth of this stream channel, there is a platform. And that platform is a platform of sediments that is interpreted to be a delta deposit. So deltas we know on Earth as platforms of layered sediment that form at the mouths of rivers when they enter into standing water. So a good example of that would be the Mississippi Delta at the mouth of the Mississippi River opening into the Gulf of Mexico. Other deltas you may be familiar with would be the Nile Delta, places like that. So this is a good site to go if we're looking for evidence of fluid of past liquid water. And now we're looking at the geology to see if we can find evidence of past life. The rover was launched in 2020 in July, so relatively early on in the pandemic. There's actually a very narrow time frame we can actually launch spacecraft to Mars. And the reason is that we have to wait until our orbits, the orbit of Earth and the orbit of Mars, are well aligned to sort of shorten the distance that spacecraft have to travel. And for that reason, there have been a number of spacecraft that have arrived to Mars lately. So, for example, the United Arab Emirates and China have recently sent rovers to Mars, or have sent spacecraft to Mars. China sent a rover, and the UAE sent an orbiter. So how did Perseverance land? Perseverance entered the Mars' atmosphere. It was slowed down by its heat shield, and then it shot off a supersonic parachute that helped slow it down even more. But it was still coming in too fast. In order to actually land the rover, what happened is that they had to create this structure called a sky crane that has these reverse thrusters that fire downward, and the rover was lowered down by a tether. And then once the rover actually landed, that sky crane could fly off and crash land a safe distance away. This is actually a very similar kind of landing technique that was used for the Curiosity rover in 2012. But the big difference here is that there was some artificial intelligence on board this rover that allowed it to image the surface of Mars and select a safe place to land. So the landing site was actually selected by the rover itself, which is very cool, without ground in the loop. But we did send it to Jezero Crater. And of course, there was a big celebration when all this occurred. A lot of excitement around was felt by many people. And when I watched this, I was definitely jumping up and down with my family, very excited. So here's what this landing site looked like. It does look pretty flat. So the rover chose wisely. It chose a nice site. When we first landed here, I was like, this looks a lot like Mars. We see rocks scattered about. You can see little tiny sand dunes that were blown from wind in the area. Off in the distance, this is actually the front of that delta that I pointed out from the orbital image. And then the other thing that we can see here are these sort of brighter patches to the left and to the right of the rover. And those are actually scour marks from the reverse thrusters of the sky crane when it was landing. And that actually exposed some underlying bedrock that we could take a peek at. Where did we actually land? We landed here. So here's the edge of that delta, and we landed here at this star. This site has been named the Octavia E. Butler Landing Site, and it's actually a really interesting site. There's a lot of geological diversity here. We have this rough unit that we've been exploring, and then there's another geologic unit here in this Patte region, which is a low-lying area that we're exploring. So this site was named for Octavia E. Butler. And for any of you, if you are sci-fi fans, I definitely encourage you to check out some of her books. Octavia E. Butler was chosen as to name the landing site because she spans both arts and sciences. But after this landing site was selected, or the landing name was selected, I started to check out her books, and now I'm hooked. So I definitely encourage you guys to check those out. So where have we driven? We've driven southward along. So here's Patte. This is that rough unit that has a bunch of craters on it. We've been checking out the geology along here, and I'm going to show you a picture that was from this site, the Rubion site. And this is where we collected we attempted to collect our first Mars sample. What you can see is that there's this rough surface here. It's fractured, and we tried to collect a sample here. These rocks, we could tell that they're pretty gunged up. They've been altered by a lot of aqueous fluids. And what do? We tried to drill into it. Here's the borehole, and you can see what this rock looks like. It's a nice dark rock. And I have to say, we didn't really know exactly what we're looking at, what the rock type was. It's taken quite a bit of time to sort of try to figure this out. And unfortunately, when we first tried to collect a sample here, we collected the sample, and when we tried to make the transfer into the rover body, unfortunately, the sample fell out, and we didn't actually, all we got was a little bit of dust. and atmosphere. So we had to try again. And so we drove on and we collected a sample of this site called Citadel from a rock called Rochette. And this is a really interesting rock because it contains these holes in it. These are interpreted to be possibly gas bubbles. And now we are increasingly convinced that what we're looking at is a lava sample. And this rock has a lot of mineralogy. So the mineralogy is consistent with it having formed as a lava. The textures are consistent with that. But then there's also these bright patches that we can see in here. And those are actually salts that precipitated in the rock. So we've seen evidence of chlorine and sulfate, chloride and sulfate salts here, including a salt that you guys know very well, halite, which is table salt. We've been able to identify these in these samples that we're going to return. So here's where we were actually able to drill into this rock. This sample was collected on September 1. And here it is. That's the rock core that was collected on that day. And we have since actually collected 2 samples from this site over the first part of September. So 2 samples. And this is a picture that the rover itself took of itself. This is what we call a selfie. And what it is that the rover has a camera on its arm, and it's able to collect a bunch of images that it can stitch together to take a picture of itself. This rover looks so clean. It's so white when they first land, and then after many years of operating on the surface, the rover is going to get dirtier and dirtier. So what's next? We've collected our sample at Citadel, and now we've actually descended into Sita, and we're planning to collect another sample here. So now that the mission is really getting going, we are collecting more and more samples. And here's what these rocks look like. They're layered rocks. They have a different mineralogy to them. And a different geological environment. We're still trying to figure out how these rocks formed. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Schmidt. Thank you to all of our presenters. It is time for the Q&A now. We've got 4 questions in the queue, but if anyone else has any questions that they've thought of, please go ahead and pop them into the chat. The first 2 questions that came in were for Dr. Richards. One was, do you have any suggestions if anyone wanted to have honeybees, or is the urban habitat too difficult for them?
That's a good question, although maybe for a different reason than you imagine. Urban habitats are fine for honeybees. Problem with honeybees is that they are basically domesticated foreign non-native species, and there is a huge amount of accumulating evidence that they are not good for wild bees. So if you think a healthy honeybee hive has 30, 50, maybe 80,000 individuals in it, all of whom are incredibly efficient foragers. Every one of those workers for that one colony is taking up floral resources that wild bees can't then have. So there's a huge amount of evidence that where you add honeybees to the mix, wild bees suffer from competition. They also carry diseases, and at least one bumblebee species in North America had very likely gone extinct because it caught diseases from domesticated honeybees. So whenever you hear somebody say, save the bees, it's not about honeybees. Honeybees have no trouble. Adding honeybees, some people say adding honeybees is kind of like trying to save bees is like putting out chickens to save birds, or guppies to save wild fish. It doesn't work. So honeybees are a domestic animal, and if you want them for their purpose, but they are not wild bees, and so we really don't recommend them.
So those shirts should probably read "Save the Wild Bees" instead of that to be more clear. Okay.
Yes.
So I'll go to the next question that came in for you, Dr. Richards, and it was that in Holland, I have seen widened berms around farmers' fields deliberately seeded with wildflowers. Would this be an attractive idea to you and your bee friends?
Yes, it would be an attractive idea. Yeah, we like bee jokes. Yes, in fact, one of the things that has happened with modern agriculture is that fields get bigger and bigger and bigger. And once they get beyond being small, they're too big for bees to cross, especially tiny bees that might only venture, tens of meters. And so they become deserts. Even if they were flowers, they say a field of sunflowers, it's not unlikely that the middle ones won't get as good pollination because the bees have to commute in from the sides. So something that's being done then is to try now and put berms around fields to actually leave corridors in the middle of fields where weeds and flowers and things are allowed to grow, so that the bees can get back into those spaces. So it's really so basically shrinking the sides of fields. So yeah, it's a great idea. And the kind of thing we would like to see more of. Ditches and those messy roadside verges, that's where a lot of bees are surviving. Those are basically saving a lot of bee populations now.
You are just music to my ears in the spring when my husband says it's time to do gardening. I'll be like, no, it isn't. Time to...
No, don't if you tidy up too early, you've got a whole lot of little bees and other little creatures that are still hiding out from inclement weather. If you clean up, then you expose them. A lot of them will die. And if they don't die, they will be seriously challenged because they won't be able to find any food. It's better to leave them sleeping. The lazy gardener has more bees. So.
There we go. Dr. Patte, one person, they had messaged me directly. So again, if you're in the chat, if you want to message me directly as well, that's fine. What are some strategies that parents can employ to best kind of help with like good, healthy development with their teens? Sometimes it feels like I'm speaking a different language than my son, especially right now.
Yes, big question. I think that's pretty typical to feel during that phase, though, so I wouldn't despair. I think just checking in the communication as open, knowing that they can talk to you if they need to, but recognizing that's pretty typical. And recognizing when there are concerns that need greater support. Keeping some structure and routine in their lives is important. Keeping bedtimes and so on. A lot of that structure that's been lost with COVID has been a great impact.
Thanks, Dr. Patte. Dr. Schmidt, two questions that came in for you. And this person, I think, was hoping I knew the answer to this, but I didn't, because they said I might have missed this. How long does it take the rovers to get to Mars? And I didn't notice if you'd said that as well. So what is that travel time like from Earth to Mars?
It's about 6 months.
Okay. And then another person had asked is, do you think that we will ever have kind of in-person examination on Mars in our lifetimes at all? Do you think that you would, instead of traveling to Iceland, will ever be actually on Mars to look at these things, or it's going to be the rover?
Well, I think that it's possible. Yeah. Within our lifetime, I think they're going to be sending astronauts to the moon relatively soon. I'm not sure exactly what the time frame is, but the idea is that we're sending astronauts to the moon to sort of prepare us for going to Mars. So yeah, I think it's coming.
Awesome. Okay.
And there's the private space technology companies like SpaceX, they want to send people to Mars as soon as possible.
Okay, well, we'll look for that big announcement at some point soon. When you have all that money, you can do those things.
I think Elon Musk says that he wants to be buried on Mars. Oh. Something like that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm learning so much today. That's all the questions that have come in directly to me, but it does take us to the end of time. So this is kind of perfect. Thank you to everyone that submitted a question. If you had a question that you didn't type in, or you think of something later, please feel free to reach out to us at Alumni and we can connect you with our speakers. And thank you again to all of our speakers for taking the time to present today and for conducting the research that you do. I feel so lucky to be part of a university that has faculty that focus on such interesting areas of research, such vastly different areas of research. As a reminder to everyone, please take some time to explore the Homecoming Hub following this session to add any events to your agenda that you might have missed, as well as learn more about those perks of being a Brock graduate. And on that note, it is time for us all to end. Have a great day, everyone, and happy homecoming.
Thank you.